thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. I'm going to explain a little bit about my work in general. And there were quite a few things mentioned already about the specific series on show here next door in the Re Gallery. But I'm gonna show a couple of different series that I made, and I think it's best to show them in chronological order because that makes it easiest for me to explain the development in my work and where I come from. So I'm just going to let the images roll on screen. If anybody has any questions, feel free to just raise your hand or interrupt. So the very first series that I made, well, the very first documentary series, and because that's really where I think my interest in photography really started, was this series that you see on screen now. It's called Lotus, and I made it for my third year at the Academy of Fine Arts in Ghent in Belgium, where I studied. And this was my bachelor degree graduation work. As Lars mentioned before, I grew up until I was about 18 in Asia, in a couple of different places, Indonesia, India, most of all Singapore, a little bit in Australia. So I traveled around a lot as a kid. And then when I was 18, it was time for me to go to university or higher education, and that brought me back to Belgium. And that's when I started studying at the academy in Ghent. So, you know, as any student, you experiment a lot. You try a lot of different things, but in my third year, I made this work for a kind of free project that we could do, and I made it in collaboration with another photographer, a student, a very good friend of mine, Quentin de Bruin, who was at the same school at the time, and it happened very spontaneously. We ended up working together in Thailand, and wanted to make a documentary work because we'd never done that before, but we were very interested in certain problematics that exist, according to us, in documentary photography and photojournalism, which brought us to make this series, which focuses around transgenders in Thailand as a subject matter. But what really interested us was what we were questioning basically was why do photojournalists or documentary images always have the need to apply a certain aesthetic to their pictures? Why when you're trying to tell a story about a certain subject or person or place, most of the time socially difficult subject matter, why do the images that are being produced by the photographers have to look beautiful or pretty or aesthetically pleasing? Because that's what we thought happened most of the time. You see dying African malnourished children photographed in beautiful golden hour sunlight, images that look like paintings, but actually the aesthetics don't stroke with the subject matter at all. So we set out and we tried to make a documentary ourselves that took this idea as a starting point. It took us a while to figure out how exactly we could take on a kind of critical stance towards our own position. And this happened in step by step, and we kind of developed a workflow together, which also became the basis for all the other works that I would make after this series. So we kind of tried to look at what the what the, maybe not stereotypes is not a good term for it, but what the criteria is for a documentary maker or a photojournalist when he chooses a subject matter. So, and every criteria we kind of try to go over the top with it. So in this case, you have it's a sensational subject. It's exotic. It takes place in a very exotic part of the world. It's very aesthetic, but above all, the ladyboys, as they're called, or transgenders, they also have something very theatrical about them. They're very proud of their bodies, of their transformation that they've made from being a man to a woman. And we thought that this was also very interesting in terms of how we looked at documentary or photojournalistic images, is that they that there is a kind of facade that takes place, something that you look at that you know that's not real in the back of your head, but in a kind of suspension of disbelief you go along with the story. So in that sense, the subject of these transgenders worked very well. And then we went on to figure out how we would which visual strategy we would apply to try and make this clear. And we ended up using a lot of artificial light, a lot of similar compositions, to try and get some kind of feeling of artificialness in the images. Our main, I think, intention or goal was to have the viewer question that what he sees, he or she sees, is authentic. And I think that's the main question I think we should still ask ourselves today when looking at these kind of images. And how far is what we see true, truthful, or real? And I think we kind of achieved that by, in a way, having very spontaneous moments of the people in the images, things that you can't really direct as a photographer or director on the scene. But at the same time, we developed this very controlled photographic environment where we could take our time to set up the camera, to define the composition, to set up the lights. And back then we weren't very good at the technical aspects of photography, so we took about half an hour to an hour to set up our stuff. So in that time, most of the time people just forgot that we were there fiddling with technical stuff. And then we had the opportunity to have these moments that are in a way go against this artificial or very controlled aspect of the way we were photographing them. These things that happen in this very theatrical environment. So that's, I think, also lays out a bit the basis of my work, and which is why I start with this series, because it's important to, I think, keep this in the back of your mind when you're looking at the rest of my work or what follows onto this. Then every now and then in the images you also see ourselves. Like there you see Quentin in the shadow, he's holding the flashlight, which lights the person there, and more little elements start appearing in the images where you see a piece of a tripod or an arm holding a flashlight to make this construction a bit more clear, but still in a subtle way. Another important thing was compositions that start at the corner of a room, which you see very often coming back in the series. And in the beautiful catalog of the Photomonth festival, I explained a little bit on how that works through images based on an exhibition we did where we recreated an entire decor from one of the images, an exact replica for an exhibition. I suggest everybody look at the catalog. Then I don't think I'm going to go through all the images of every series because that might take a while. But another very important aspect of this work was, of course, going back to this question of aesthetics and rules that the photographer always lives by or always tries to achieve. We gave some of the ladyboys a small disposable 35mm camera and told them to just finish the roll, all the pictures on the camera, and give it back. We didn't give them any directions or any ideas on what we were expecting. And when we developed those pictures, we saw something very interesting that, of course, well, it's kind of, you could kind of expect it, but we never knew it was going to be so extreme. That what we see here is actually a lot more interesting than the pictures we made in terms of revealing something about the subject matter. Here you see a scene where they're sitting in their living room, putting on makeup, playing around, very crooked images, no regard for composition or light, very, I don't know if you can call them authentic, but at least a lot more authentic than an image like this. Also, you can see the same people come back. So this is the same person. This is the PDF of the book. I think also it's a completely different reading when you again look at it in the book. It's something I mentioned before, that the book form is always what I strive for as an end result. So in the book, these yellow pages flap open, and then you get to see the images that they made on these 35mm cameras, also not sequenced or edited or changed in any way, just from the first image on the roll to the last. And for us, this in a way proved our point of what we were trying to say in terms of an aesthetic approach when looking at a certain subject matter and questioning why photographers always strive to achieve some kind of aesthetically coherent images, when what is really interesting is what actually happens in the pictures. I'll show a couple of more examples. This was also quite nice. This is a kind of flower ritual which Aum, the person in the picture here, did, which again references to her Buddhist religion, which we think is quite an important factor for why transgenderism is so widely accepted in Thailand. These images were probably taken in the space of 10 seconds. Maybe they were trying to just finish the roll. I don't know. Just try and find one of the most surprising rolls. This one. So here we see Sonia. She takes a self-portrait, and then we have an image which is most probably her bedroom, of a painting of a waterfall painted on the wall behind shiny light blue curtains. And then the rest of the entire roll is this kind of road trip of landscapes made out of a car, and then on a particular place. This is, again, the interpretation changes by placing this in the context of a photo book, where maybe the reader will search for some poetic meaning behind these images. We also never asked her what she actually meant by it. Maybe she just really didn't want to do it and tried to finish the camera as quickly as possible, or maybe she really tried to do something interesting with it. And here I think it becomes a very fine line in the context of what we were questioning with this work. So when I finished this series, I started a master degree at the same school. I'm just going to open the files first. And I had to look for a new subject matter. I wanted to continue this approach of documentary making. But like in Lotus, what I found important is the choice of the subject matter, that it wasn't just something that maybe interested me on a social level or came from a very personal motivation, maybe. The main criteria for choosing the subject matter was that I wanted to explore how, instead of reality dictating images or reality dictating fiction, I wanted to see how it worked the other way around, how fiction can influence reality or how images have a role to play in reality. So what I needed was a subject matter that had this duality in itself already, so that I didn't have to apply some kind of strategy to lay out both sides. And I came to Bollywood cinema. This also again comes from an earlier period where I was cast as an extra on a film set where I had to dance in the background on a Bollywood film set that was supposed to take place somewhere in the West where they needed lots of white people to fill the scene. And I was very fascinated by how that worked and the experience of how Bollywood movies are made. And then if anybody's ever been in India, you probably notice how prominent this cinema world is, or how it seeps into every level of everyday life. And then you start seeing the more extreme things that people, for example, temples are built for certain movie stars, that they're really admired like gods. That every ringtone on a cell phone is a love song from a Bollywood film. It's everywhere, and it's absolutely dominant on the perception of reality. The beautiful thing is also that the cinemas in India are not only for the privileged. You have also cinemas that are for very underprivileged people, that don't really cost much, and that they say people that work very hard during the day go and live out their fantasies or their dreams in the movie theater in the evenings. Sometimes they even throw money at the screen when their favorite actor appears for the first time. So that was really the ideal subject for me, for what I wanted to try and show, how influential this cinema world can be on everyday life. So as you saw in the video in the beginning, maybe not all of you, the way I figured out on how to best show this, because of course, in the contrary to Lotus, it's kind of an abstract subject matter. It's not something you can spot in the street and say, there's a transgender, now we can make a picture because we have our subject. This was really something that needed to be constructed from zero. It was something that had to be shown or suggested, but there wasn't really anything concrete that I could photograph. But like you see in the video, what I think was the most crucial part of the work, that once Victoria and I started setting up our camera on the street and the lights and choosing a location, very quickly lots of people started to gather around to see what we were doing. Maybe they thought that they could catch a glimpse of a famous Bollywood star or something. So before you know it, you have this massive crowd standing around you, which is quite scary at first, but after a while you get used to it. And then all I had to do really was to just ask who wanted to be the actor of my scene for that brief moment. And this is what proves how powerful this fantasy or this cinema world is, that immediately people jumped in the scene and started to pretend like they were stars for my camera, which was wonderful. so the whole series is built out of these kind of scenes where people take hold of the scene and actually kind of play a game. It's a kind of game between me and the people you see. None of the people in the images are professional actors or people from the cinema world. They're just all people that that we met while walking through the city. So this is kind of, I think, a step further in terms of the theatrical element that you saw in Lotus or in the previous series, that now the scenes that are made are really in dialogue with the personal imagination of the people that you see. But it's not really enough, because this whole story that I've just told you, you can't read that from the images themselves. The context is always necessary if you really want to bring across a message with images, in my opinion. So we added another element, and those are the texts you see appearing on screen. These are just quotes, so they're little pieces from original newspaper articles. We read a lot of newspapers, which are mostly in English in India, where some kind of confusion occurs between this cinema world and the real world, or where there is an overlap between the two, which you see a lot in these very sensational Indian newspapers, which is great for content, of course, which also followed on the next, on the other series that you see in the gallery space. And then in the book, again, this is a slideshow, it's a different presentation of the work, but in the book, at the back, you have an index with all the original newspaper articles, so that you can, that the work gets a completely different reading once you've read those full articles. But just to give an example, one of the quotes that you see pass by is, let me think, which is a good one to pick. Maybe a bit of a tragic one. A little boy called Sohail, it's one of the later quotes, watches his favorite TV series, and in that TV series his most admired actor dies. But in the next episode, this actor comes back to life. And because Sohail thinks that maybe he could also come back to life in a different way, just like his idol did, he kills himself. So there you have a kind of ultimate transgression between two different realities. Another more simple one is a car chase happening in the middle of the city, with police and criminals, and hundreds of people start to gather around because they think it's an action scene from a Bollywood movie, but it happens to be a real car chase. So the book is kind of structured around all these little events with which the images are then kind of associated or loosely related. So the sequence is based on these stories that flow through the book. This was also my first self-published book, and it was completely printed on newspaper, which is a reference to the articles taken from the newspapers we found there. And also it gives it, by printing the images on newspaper, the idea was that it gives it instantly a kind of more factual feel to it, because we're so used to seeing images that are supposedly truthful in the newspapers. I can quickly show a couple of images from the book. Unfortunately, I don't have it with me. Oops. There's something wrong here.
might be worth pointing out that all of Max's books are sold out, but the one on Thailand is coming out soon, so you can order.
Good one, Lars. Good one.
I'm giving back the favor, and I've seen the layout and it looks great. So look out for the publication date and.
Yeah. So one of the most, I think to me, still one of the most important works I've made so far is the first one that I showed, Lotus, which I was never able to publish as a student. But now finally I'm publishing it, so it will come out next month. Here are some quick images of the layout. Yeah, they're a bit small. Sorry for that. Of the Fourth Wall book on newspaper print. So to move on, after I made this work and graduated from art school, I immediately got a request from a big biannual arts festival called Europalia India in Belgium, called Europalia. Actually, Europalia is a festival that every 2 years works together with another host country. Last year it was Turkey, next year it's going to be Indonesia. But the year after I graduated, it was Europalia India. And they asked me to go back to India and make a new body of work in the same sense as the Fourth Wall. This was absolutely a fantastic opportunity for me, especially just being graduated from school and immediately being given an exhibition space and the support to go and make a new work. But the main thing that I struggled with is I had just spent 5 months in India working on the Fourth Wall, and only 2 months later had to go back to find a new subject to work on. So that was a little bit tricky. But I also like the way it follows up on the previous work. So the previous work really deals with this cinema world that is so deeply ingrained. And with this work, so this is Will They Sing Like Raindrops or Leave Me Thirsty, which you see in the gallery, follows up on the Bollywood thread by choosing the most important theme in a Bollywood film, which is the love story. And as I think most of you were probably there during the introduction, but I'll repeat it briefly. It's a love story and has 2 elements. On the one side, you have this organization called the Love Commandos, which is a very kind of socially relevant, contemporary subject, which is dealing with issues in society in India today. So it's an interesting subject from a point of view that it's very it says a lot about the society. And on the other hand, you have this fictional world, which is as important, I think. And they both deal with the same notion of love, but maybe completely opposites. They're completely opposites of each other, and they influence each other, definitely, because as we said, these couples in these shelters are running away together from their families because they're not allowed to be together, because they come from different castes or religions or social status. There's a whole range of criteria. So when young people fall in love, for example, a Muslim and a Hindu, it's very difficult for them to get married and actually be together because the families will end up murdering them. But then, of course, this whole idea of running away together and leaving everything behind and starting a new life together is also in many ways influenced by what they see in the movies, and how they've been educated by the movies and by the Bollywood-esque idea of romance also, of course, influences how they deal with this situation. So in this series, that's something I try to show, how you can, on the one hand, then maybe on a level of the image or the strategy that I try to use, that you have a core documentary subject which is very straightforward. But on the other hand, all these scenes that are staged in a similar way as the work you saw before, that reference to these ideas of love or love stories or other issues that deal with that subject in a more, let's say, abstract way. So, for example, this kid, this is not necessarily somebody that's dealing with these issues of being hunted down by his family, or these two. But it's all about trying to visualize the stories that could happen or that happen to these people that are in these shelters. And again, it's about contextualizing these images, because by bringing these scenes together with the scenes of the couples in the shelters, you create a completely different reading of the work. As I said earlier, also in this work, I started to use a lot more found images, or images that I didn't make myself, kind of external footage, and use that for trying to get information across that couldn't be really communicated through images themselves. So here, for example, these, in the book you see it in the gallery upstairs as well, you have these texts which all come from the website from the Love Commandos, where people try to express their problems. Or also you have many people that say how horrible the Love Commandos organization is, because the tradition of arranged marriage has been in place for centuries and has always worked. So I think as a, you could say, Western photographer dealing with a subject as such, where in our Western world it might sound very strange that your parents choose who you're supposed to marry with. In India they call the marriages we have love marriages. It's tough to not have an explicit stance on this issue, because on the one hand, when somebody says this system has been in place for thousands of years and has worked, you start to think about all the reasoning behind that, and I don't think that one is better than the other, but of course it's difficult to maintain this stance when you're working on a project like this as a couple, then moreover a Western couple, together with people who are in such a horrific situation. They even started questioning us about why we weren't married, which was a tough one to answer in such a context. Some of you might wonder why these pictures are shown in sequences. This was another way for me to make a distinction between couples who are really in danger, or this actual subject matter, and the more staged tableaus that happen outside of that. I didn't want it to be a vague line, I wanted it to be very clear, because I didn't want to confuse the two so much that you could think that all these people in the images are in this situation. So one of the strategies I used was to show every image of a session in sequence, and I think this worked specifically well, as you see here, that their expressions change enormously, which reveals some way of where the photographer makes the choice of how he wants to represent these people. You know, I could just choose to show this image and then tell you all that they're very happy all the time, or I could choose this one and then they might be a very concerned couple. So by showing all these images in sequence, I think it also again questions this kind of stance of objectivity when you're talking about documentary photography. I'm gonna skip a little through it. This one I mentioned before. It's a story that it's an image that depicts a story of how two people met. Some images are, in a way, for me, I think the complexity or the poetic element in them that makes it interesting. I don't always know why I take certain pictures, but for example, this one, afterwards it becomes clear to me what makes it a good image, again, in this context, where you have all these men playing the strategic game of chess, with this girl daydreaming away in the middle, which maybe says something about how the men are mostly in control in Indian society. I again worked with newspapers, newspaper clippings, especially to show the horrific events that happen during these honor killings, something that I thought wasn't necessary to photograph or to visualize. I think this image is the one that comes closest to any kind of violence. That's a body being cremated. So I think in the way that I try to tell stories, I'm always trying to look for how I can maybe communicate something about a certain idea that is as much about images or the approach of a documentary photographer as about the subject matter. And it's always an exercise of balancing the two, not to have the subject take the overhand, not to have the story only be about the people you see in the images, but also about the approach or the personal view, or how images can function in a sequence, for example, or how texts massively influence the reading of the images and so on. And I think in the form of a book, this again really comes best to the foreground in comparison to a slideshow. Does anybody have any questions about this work?
How much did collaboration play a part in this project? You said you were working with your partner. What do you each do?
Okay, that's a good question. Victoria, she's sitting in the crowd and still not here. But Victoria basically does a very large part of the research. So looking into anything that has to do with the subject, finding places of interest where we could go, deals with a lot of the practical issues. And then of course also the workflow that I established with Quentin de Bruin, the other photographer that I worked with in Lotus, really demanded two people at least to just physically be able to do that, because you have to, you know, carry a lot of equipment. You have to make sure your stuff doesn't get stolen while you're talking to the people you're photographing and so on. So yeah, in a way it's kind of the function of an assistant, but also the research and the development of the concept come into that, and I think that's developing more and more the longer we work together. So who knows, we might be a duo sometime soon. Then of course you have other collaborations, like with the sculptor to make the light boxes, or the Tower of Ice at the beginning of the series, which are other inputs from different angles, which I always try to look for, because I think in a way I'm always looking for how I can work with different mediums or different materials or different approaches, but it's very difficult to do that, because I think if you really live with one way of storytelling or one medium, you really get to know it on a different level than if you make a sculpture one day and then a painting the week after. And that's why through collaborations this becomes possible, that you can work with these different views on things but still maintain yourself in the same work. That was the template I was talking about earlier, with the couples that can't afford nice wedding clothes, and then they can stick their faces on the template. And that's also something I find very beautiful, and realized in India, that I think if a couple would do that here and send that image to their family, the family would say, this is fake, you're trying to cheat us, what is this? We don't appreciate it. But in India, that question is often completely surpassed. It's not about somebody faking something to try and represent themselves in a different way. It's much more about what they're actually trying to say or communicate with the image. So it gets read also in a very different way. And I think this kind of Western aesthetic that I've developed, which has references to classical Western painting and the way of composing images, the use of lighting, is something I also very boldly apply to make my stance as a person from the West obvious, or not try to hide it in a way. I could tell anecdotes with most of these images, but I don't think it's going to be interesting that way. That's the bed. Apparently, Radha and Krishna come to sleep every night. Radha and Krishna are the two most iconic lovers in Hindu mythology. I'm going to move on to the next and final work, which is a work in progress, and which I actually haven't talked about yet publicly. So if anybody has any questions, or if I'm unclear, feel free to interrupt. It's a work that I started last year, and will probably be working on for the next year or maybe two. It's a work again in collaboration with another artist, Michiel Burger, a Dutch photographer or maybe archaeologist. It's a bit vague how he chooses to define himself. But the main thing about Michiel Burger is that he is very interested in archives and found material. So last year, Michiel Burger and I were invited to the Archive of Modern Conflict in London. Some of you may know it. It's a privately owned archive of very interesting photographic material. The Zoom is going to be tough, sorry about that. In that archive, we found a folder of material relating to the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya. We didn't really know what the Mau Mau were when we found that folder, but we were very intrigued by the content. And after doing a little bit of research, we found out that the Mau Mau were the rebels who tried to kind of evict the British imperialist government from Kenya. Kenya was also the last British colony of the British Empire. So it was really one they were trying to hold on to strongly. And the Mau Mau were the main force that made sure Kenya was brought to independence. But so in this London archive, the story of the Mau Mau was really presented in a very strong propaganda manner. So they were terrorists. They came at night and slashed entire families with machetes. They were uncultured beasts who were very dangerous. The folder is full of images of atrocity which were used by the British for propaganda against the Mau Mau. But something didn't really seem to fit about this story, and it was getting more and more obvious that it was a very, very bold collection of propaganda material against this terrorist group. So Michiel and I decided to go to Kenya and try and see if there was anything we could find about the Mau Mau there today. This is between 1952 and 58, so that's say about 60 years ago. And when we got to Kenya, we saw that the Mau Mau were actually celebrated as the freedom fighters that brought Kenya independence. So, of course, the typical question of terrorist or freedom fighter was very clear here. You have statues of the main Mau Mau leaders. Sorry, it has to load for a while. Set up in the middle of Nairobi, whereas this same person in the British propaganda material was framed as a very barbaric, evil man. And then we began to spot things like the Kenyan statue of independence, which is a complete copy of this Iwo Jima image from Joe Rosendahl. But in a sense doesn't really have anything to do with it. It's just an empty icon that's been applied for a similar ideological reason. And that's what the work started to become about, how images and iconology can define this history. Here you see the main Mau Mau leader has become into this kind of Che Guevara icon. Now, in terms of today, the Mau Mau are these 80 and 90-year-old men who are still alive, fortunately. And when you start talking to these men, they tell a completely opposite story of the British events, of what you read in British history books, where the Mau Mau, were terrorists that killed British families in the night and so on. There's a professor called Caroline Elkins from the States who did a research on it recently, not very long ago, and figured out by talking to people, because of course these Mau Mau don't have any visual history. They didn't have cameras. They didn't have any way of recording what was happening. She figured out that the British put all the people of one tribe, the Kikuyu tribe, from which most Mau Mau warriors came from, put them in kind of, they call them concentration camps. I still don't know if that's the right term to use, but work camps, labor camps. This is 1952, so this is really not long after the events of the Second World War. And she managed to retrace that about at least 100,000 Kikuyu people were tortured and eventually hanged. Now today, and still today, there is a court case going on where the British government is paying compensation to these Mau Mau veterans that are still alive today. So that makes it a very interesting and very relevant subject matter on a lot of different levels. For example, here, the main way these Mau Mau veterans claim their compensation is by showing wounds that were inflicted upon them during these days of war. But of course, I can go a lot into the history, but during the war with the British against the Mau Mau, you had home guards, which were Kenyans that fought on the British side, and then you had the Mau Mau, which were Kenyans that fought against the British. And of course, when the British lost the war and independence came, after independence, a lot of people also decided that they were Mau Mau and not home guards. So you have a very much a confusion between who was fighting on which side. Lots of Mau Mau were actually fighting on the side of the British and vice versa. And then also with these scars, maybe some men cut themselves with their machete while farming in their land and now have a kind of proof to claim compensation. You also have different Mau Mau veteran groups who claim that the other group is a fake group and that this is a real group and so on. So there's a whole also political struggle that's maybe motivated by this compensation claim that the British now decide to pay. This is actually the veteran group that we then went on to work with. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures from what we attempted to do. So we got these, we went out with these Mau Mau veterans into the bushes. And we tried to explain, we actually sat down at a table with them and we told them, look, this is how the British have been representing you still until today. We showed them some of the horrific propaganda material. And we asked them if you were given the chance to create visuals that would represent your side of the story, how would you go about doing it? And that's how we ended up staging these scenes where they either present themselves as heroic or either present themselves as victims, and always in complete coordination with the Veteran Association, of course. These are all images that may or may not be used in the series. It's still a long process. Stories of how they used to hide from British troops and so on. Here they reenacted on how they were rounded up to go into the camps. We chose to use two different formats to question the idea of transparency with images that are of lesser quality. So this is made with a very crappy digital camera, very pixelated, whereas the other images that I showed earlier are made with a 6x7 camera. And here the theatrical element is very much moved to the foreground, that the viewer knows that they're playing a game, that it's about this act that they're showing us, this pride. Whereas in these images, they may come across as much more transparent or authentic. This is an oathing ceremony, that's another issue. Then another part of the project I'll quickly go over is there is lots of mass graves in Kenya where thousands of people were buried by the British, but which are not marked in any way, which are not, fenced or have no signs. So a heritage warden who is in charge of finding all these places brought us to the locations of the mass graves, which we documented in a very straightforward way. And it's a bit of a sensitive issue at the moment because the veterans are currently in a case with the British government, so they prefer to wait that we release this project until after the case has been settled. I will show two quick video clips, maybe one short one, and then for the longer one I'll choose as an ending for the talk this evening. This is Kimunya. He's one of the more legendary Mau Mau warriors, who was very proud to tell us about his fight against the British.
When we want to ambush you, we cannot show you the gun, the paga, behind the paga. When I come close to you, that is the time I will get the paga and cut you direct. When I get you that one, I cut you neck. You lay down and I cut the stomach. But you cannot survive. From there, second time, I cut you here and here.
So we made a series of these little films which we're still figuring out how we can use in the form of an installation. Here's another one of General Bahati. He's one of the main Mau Mau generals, who we asked to sit on a horse while giving a speech to a supposed army that he's about to command. But of course, a Mau Mau general would never sit on a horse because they didn't have any horses. But that's again what makes it interesting for us is our kind of Western idea of a military leader sits on a horse. So we decided to put him on.
Kenya. We muzungu mugereza. Ule tono wangu wa makeri, ule hando sigari go kuchameze ba yothe cyandege cyamaguru. Ndakwira go kutinda wikaro waku. Wikaro waku ore roraya go kunizwe adwairo tokuga nizwe twekuo na nizwe gikona mumbi. Kuma bero na embu na gikoyori nizwe tweguku. Kwogwo muzungu sega na utwale mbiraro yaku kurwa kwenda. Ni undu cyo to utiga wachoka waku we na thigari ciaku tutigo bururi witu na ngai na utwekagwo na utuhingiria ni undu ichi na indo cito cia mundu muiru na riu urenda gucihahama tora wekire wayaki ukioraga ukimuzika ari muoyo we ni ndagwatha na ndagukania riu ndagikeno bara ni twambaniria nawe riu na twambaniria nawe Mungereza ore rugura wangu wa makeri Queen Elizabeth ndakwira kuma hau ndore Kenya na gotiro ndogweka ni undu ngai twi nake na ni atorazimeire bururi uyu witu kwogwo we leu ni twambiriria na ni ugothie na ni ukonina nganja izwe twi ya no koga bururi mara twakanite namo ati ni okuhe wiyathi Kenya korore koloni yaku urongo ego korwe tale ogokotale na Kenya colony umetua ati Kenya ne colony yaku liganiro tola liganiro ni nyondo cia maitu gwo rira wongaga.
So you can see that he improvises quite well while giving a speech. And this man is 88 years old. And what we find the most interesting in the way that they choose to represent themselves is that currently at this time it's very much in their interest to really take up their role as victims, to really present themselves as the victims of the torture of the British Empire. And then on the other hand you have this opposite extreme representation from the British side as the Mau Mau as terrorists. So I'm gonna stop it there. If anybody has any questions or would like to open a discussion. Yeah.
Do you think it's essential that you're not British and that you're exploring the post-colonial legacy of not your own country?
Well, I think Belgium has an equally bad colonial past with Congo and Leopold II. But I don't think it's essential that I'm not British. I think it would be very interesting if a British artist dealt with the subject as well as the same way that I would maybe at one point also like to deal with the Congo history. But in a way it really comes down to pretty much the same problematic, I think. And the way this subject came to us was in such a natural way, you could say, that that it's not something specifically picked for motivations that go all the way back in that way. Yeah.
Please just raise a hand, and I will pass microphone.
Yeah, I still have a question on the series, which is on the project, which is on display here. On the lovers in the shelter. I suppose these people are real, and they are real lovers. I was wondering, are you not scared as a photographer that these people are... because you mentioned that when they will be discovered, they will be killed. That through your photography, these people are...
exposed?
Exposed, yeah?
Yeah. That's a good question, and that's something we were worrying about as well when we were making the work. But all the people that in the shelter that you see in the images there are a lot more couples than we ever got to see, and those were the ones that had made a agreement with the organization to be able to be photographed, and also very often their stories were told in the press. The organization makes sure that there are always couples. Some are very high profile from very rich families, or maybe mafia families that end up in these places, and those are the couples that they have to communicate these stories to the press. But there are a lot of other couples. There may be 12, 13 shelters in New Delhi alone. And this is the only one you can visit as a correspondent. Yeah, so everybody there has kind of agreed on being photographed.
So how about the situation that you're putting some totally strangers into this context of this
Of this love story?
Yeah. So doesn't put like a regular people who don't have anything to do with this situation, but within your book, within the context that you're putting them in, doesn't it put them
in that situation?
Yeah, in danger, sort of. No?
Well, yes and no, because of course you also have the complete other side of the situation, and that's the sequence I think that will follow now. Is, for example, the couples that do get married in a traditional sense, with a big Indian wedding where the families choose to who they marry and so on. Most of them are those kind of couples, and here you see a whole traffic jam of couples that go on honeymoon to a very popular spot in the Himalayas. So by putting, let's say, a non-love marriage people together with people that most probably, but we also don't know for a large part, that are married in a traditional way, the only connotation or connection you could make is by assuming that one is the other, or vice versa. But that's why it was so important for me to make that distinction between the two, and which is why all the runaway couples are photographed in the same space and never outside. That you always see these blue walls. In the book, they're always in these sequences. The binding of the paper in the book is different to the ones outside of that. So in that way I try to keep the two different, but I of course understand the question is you're combining both of them anyway. But I think that's again a way for me to try and move away from this very dominating subject that you always have to deal with as a documentary maker, which is, I don't think is necessary. I think you can tell a story also with subjects that don't directly have to do with your main core person or place or organization. For example, this guy, his name is Din. The original article is in the exhibition. It's kind of like a mini narrative that you find throughout the book also. And it's a story of him that in the matrimonial section of the newspaper, he bought the entire page, which probably cost a couple of thousand euros, to find himself a new wife. And there he explains, you know, what he has. He has villas and airplanes and so on. And he did about 20 interviews with women a day from all over the world that came to talk to him, to potentially marry him, most probably for his money. So when we read that, we met him and we took a portrait of him. We talked to him, listening to his story. And only 3 months later, just before we were about to leave India, he had found his chosen wife. So I think by making the spectrum so broad, that it doesn't only have to be about that one element.
Feel free to ask.
There is someone in front of you.
I've got a question about your formal strategies, because you seem to be, for each project, looking for ways to show different aspects. Are your formal strategies in service of the subject, or in the service of the ethics of representation, or in a service of, I mean, how are they perpetuated, by what kind of thinking?
Well, I always try to do it in service of the subject, absolutely. But it's not always that easy, because for me the aesthetics, in a way, have to deal directly with how a subject can be represented or how it relates to aesthetics itself or the image. But then when images are made in a certain aesthetic, there are so many more things that are interesting about it than only this relation or only this choice. There are things that you see, or details that appear, that maybe give it a different meaning or make it very interesting. And that's why I think I still choose to work in a similar way. I wouldn't say it's the same way, because maybe I see the nuances in a different way in terms of lighting or how exactly I make the images. But you know, things like this interest me. This might be like very small details, but I like the way that rope is lying there, and it's not something that maybe needs some kind of explanation. But then, if you compare that to the very pixelated images of the Mau Mau veterans with their heads on, that's something completely different, but it doesn't speak to me in the same way that these kind of images do. So it's also something that I'm constantly looking for, you know, how these aesthetics work, and why I make these choices, which are also very subconscious most of the time, I think. Yeah.